Artificial intelligence in the military needs to be reliable, and Grok ain't that. I'm Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic, and let's dive in. Now, there was a really interesting write up in the Wall Street Journal by Shalini Ramachandran, Heather Somerville, and Amrith Ramkumar. And quite frankly, I think this is an important one because US officials at multiple federal agencies have raised concerns about the safety and reliability of Elon Musk's XAI artificial intelligence tools in recent months, highlighting continuous disagreements with the US government about which AI models to deploy, according to people familiar with the matter, obviously talking to the Wall Street Journal. Now, these warnings preceded the Pentagon's decision this week to put XAI at the center of some of the nation's most sensitive and secretive operations by agreeing to allow its chatbot Grok to be used in classified settings. The Pentagon has given one of XAI rivals, Anthropic, a Friday deadline, basically today, to agree to looser rules on its use by the US military. And for the record, Anthropic was the only developer approved for classified work before the deal between XAI and the military. And Anthropic, for the record, has since bowed out. And basically, they did not want to turn their artificial intelligence into an autonomous weapons capable AI, among other concerns that they had. President Trump took to True Social today to essentially decry Anthropic's choices, so they appear to be out of the running for this. And throughout the government, agencies have been racing to deploy AI for a host of purposes, but the debate over which models to use has become increasingly political. Senior officials, including at the White House, view Anthropic's outspoken stances on safety and ties essentially to their donors, which tend to be on the Democratic side, as potentially making the company quote unquote too woke to be a reliable provider. Now, I don't care what your politics are. My default preamble is cybersecurity is agnostic to politics, but we're not immune from it. And this is exactly one of the cases that we are seeing right now. But the looser controls on Grok and Musk's quote unquote absolutist stance on free speech, which quite frankly, he is not an absolutist on free speech, have made essentially Grok a more attractive choice for the Pentagon. Other officials have questioned whether Grok's looser controls present risks. Ed Force, the top official at the General Services Administration, or GSA, which is the procurement arm of the federal government in recent months, sounded an alarm with White House officials after potential safety issues with Grok. Again, according to people familiar with this, other GSA officials, under him, have also raised safety concerns about Grok, which they viewed as sycophantic and too susceptible to manipulation or corruption by faulty or biased data, creating a potential system risk. And for the record, essentially, Elon Musk has been caught tampering with Grok when he didn't like answers that essentially it gave, and basically adjusting and tweaking things on the fly. And so, obviously, that would be a concern, especially if we are talking about the outfit that performs war fighting on behalf of the nation. And if you recall, at the time, in late December and early January, Grok was under fire for allowing sexualized editing of photos, including that of children, meaning it didn't really have any safeguards, to the point where multiple nations, including the EU itself, Canada, and others, have begun investigating Grok's use. Government officials saw basically the issue as representative of how Grok could be exploited by bad actors. And so I think this is a great write up by the Wall Street Journal. There was way more to that article than that, but that is the primer. And so I did my homework on this and spent some time basically piecing this together. And if the Department of Defense slash War is going to basically pick an AI to integrate into their operations, it has to meet standards of reliability given the sensitivity of the work that the Pentagon does. And so, in my estimation, and with everything that I've read, talking or rather reading AI ethicists and others, there are some critical points here that any artificial intelligence would need to meet at a minimum if we were going to integrate it into something as sophisticated and potentially dangerous as the center of the military in the United States. First, the AI must demonstrate predictable outputs within clearly defined operational contexts with quantified confidence intervals and validated edge case behavior. In other words, you can't just let this thing go. You have to make sure that it is consistent and constantly check up on it. On top of it, Accuracy requirements should be tied to consequence severity. So, for example, there should be an over 99.9% precision for target identification and a much lower tolerance for false positives in lethal contexts. Systems that have to withstand adversarial inputs as well, think evasion, poisoning, prompt injection, data drift, all of these things the GSA officials were talking about is also very critical. And this has to be validated through independent red team testing that aligns with the risk management framework that NIST has put out for artificial intelligence and also the DoD's AI ethical principles, assuming that they're not going to change those anytime soon. Now, also, on top of that, every output must be reconstructible, right? We need logging, model versioning, as well to understand output from one version to another, provenance tracking of the data, reproducible, basically results for things like after action review and legal defensibility as well. In other words, it can't just make a decision and then go ahead and launch the nukes. It has to basically output a reason. Well, given all of this, this is my decision, and here we go. And for any system, basically influencing force deployment, lethal action, or strategic signaling, human override must be technically enforced, not just policy dependent. In other words, there has to be a human that can override instantly the artificial intelligence if it really does say launch the nukes when that is a way overkill. And if you want to go, if you think that's crazy, go check out my past segment the other day on essentially that. Basically, Gemini, ChatGPT, and Anthropic Claude, when given war game scenarios, went to nuking the planet 95% of the time as an ultimate resolution because they don't have ethical boundaries. They're not worried about their kids when they're pushing a button like a human would be. And we want that, right? On the button. Also, under degraded inputs or contested communications or corrupted data feeds, the AI has to default to a conservative, non escalatory output rather than essentially extrapolating beyond the bounds that have been validated for it. In other words, it has to basically fail safe. In other words, if it's going to fail or it has problems or whatever it is, it has to default on the let's not nuke the planet side of the equation. And then there also has to be a full S bomb, right? Basically, a to understand for the supply chain that training pipelines and model components, cryptographic signing of model weights, continuous integrity monitoring, all of these are compliant with the DoD's zero trust architecture. In other words, we can't play fast and loose with this. One of the big issues with AIs is okay, if you're giving it input, does anybody else have back end access? Well, we can't allow like, an Elon Musk or the CEO of Anthropic or whoever gets, these contracts access into these systems because there's a ton of sensitive data that they may not necessarily have clearance for. So that's incredibly important as well. On top of it, there has to be ongoing performance monitoring against real world drift, automatic rollback capability, basically checks on bias, anomaly thresholds, all that kind of stuff. So that is one of those big considerations that's written in. Right now, Grok does not appear to have that. I'm not saying Anthropic does, but Anthropic has had more validation than Grok when it comes to sensitive materials. So, also, if we are talking about things like nuclear or cyber or even kinetic decisions that the AI would make, supports and systems should prioritize minimizing false positives over recall to avoid inadvertent escalation. So, in other words, it has to start looking first to see, okay, what is a potential false positive here? It has to be more conservative than just again launch the missiles, right? Also, embedded constraints are needed to ensure alignment with the Law of Armed Conflict or LOAC. These are basically the rules of engagement, or part of the rules of engagement. And also, there is something called the DoD Directive 3000.09, which relates to autonomy in weapon systems. All of this has to be aligned and constrained with that. We can't have these things going Terminator on us. And I quite frankly think that's a big one, and I am a sci fi nerd, but that's a huge one. And on top of it, third party evaluation under defense grade assurance framework. So, as an example, formal verifications for safety critical modules, reliability testing, FIPS 140 3, which is the new cryptographic standard, replacing 140 2, for the AI's components. All of this needs to be in place. This is not an easy decision. This is not a decision I think personally that should be political. I do not care the politics of Anthropic or Elon Musk or Grok or XAI or OpenAI or any of them. The goal is to get something that's going to be safe, reliable, capable. We know this is coming, and we can't simply just either ignore it or just let it go fly by night, do what you want, install what you want. There has to be a rigorous process. There has to be a ton of oversight on this. And I'm just not a fan in general of integrating AI. But I know that if the United States isn't doing it, China, Russia, et cetera, will. And so we're never going to get rid of this race, unless we just decide to ban collectively all 8+ billion of us artificial intelligence, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. So here we are. Best of luck to us, but quite frankly, Grok as it stands right now, I'm not a fan of having that virtual finger on the button. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please, please, please attempt to stay private, secure, and informed. Take care.